Hello and welcome back to another episode of You Want to Do What with Dan and Julie. Today we have William Sitwell on, who is a food critic. Hi William, how are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thank you. Nice to speak to you.
And you, thank you for coming on. So how did you get into the world of food critic?
Gosh. Well, there's a very there's a short version to this story, and also there's a sort of long version. I mean, I became the restaurant critic for the Telegraph literally within days of leaving a job that I had had for about 20 years as editor of a magazine for Waitrose called Waitrose Food, and I'd worked for a company called John Brown Media, and I was lucky to be sort of scooped up after I quit that job. But I suppose it was a sort of long term coming, in that I'd been writing about food for about 20 years, been a journalist for a bit longer. I'd sort of fallen into the food sphere, if you like, by luck or mistake or good fortune, whatever you want to call it. So my name was out there. I had lots of writing experience. So I suppose in a way it took me sort of 30 years to get that job. And there aren't many jobs as restaurant critics. And if you think, if you're thinking about kind of official if you're thinking about official newspapers, Charles Campion used to say there are more F1 drivers on the grid than there are mainstream restaurant critics. So it's quite a tough challenge to get those jobs. But so yeah, I mean, I'm a scribbler who found a subject and stuck with it, really.
Yeah, I always find it interesting, journalists who sort of focus on something and have that as like their passion. You can sort of bring two things together. So how did you actually just fall into being a food critic?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of my early jobs was as a journalist on the Sunday Express. And when I was in my kind of early 20s, kind of looking around for something to do, really. I mean, I'd been a rep on a Greek island for a travel company. I'd been a minicab driver. I'd had some terrible job in an accounts department of, I think it was Topshop, and got sort of sacked after the first day. Terrible figures. I'd done various sort of jobs, and I kind of thought that I wanted to be in the media. I used to have a column on our student newspaper at university, and I had a little radio show, and I sort of felt that was definitely my sort of the area that I wanted to go in, and I come from a family of writers. Whether that's of any help or not, I don't know. And I remember actually I was introduced to a very senior executive at News International. He was a guy called Andrew Knight, who was a friend of his friend was the father of old pal of mine. And I went to see him, and he said, if you want to get ahead in the media, you need to get a subject, and you need to become an expert on that. And he sort of said, you need to be the go-to man about beer or something. And I sort of thought, well, I don't know anything about anything. How am I going to find a subject that I know something about? I mean, I'm interested in politics. I studied politics at university, but I didn't think I was about to become a political correspondent. I'd done some work on the sort of newspaper diaries. And it was only later that I kind of fell into food, and then found a subject, and then stuck at it. And then retrospectively, I suppose I'd taken on this wonderful advice, but it had taken me a good 10 years. And I suppose I got into food journalism when I knew someone had suggested that I went for a job as deputy editor of this magazine, Waitrose Food Illustrated. And this was before it had done a tie-up with Waitrose. It was just called Food Illustrated at that point. Mm. Anyway, and I'd been where was I at the time? Oh, I was languishing at a magazine called Woman's Journal as features editor. And the new editor, there was this wonderful woman called Marcel Dargy-Smith had recruited me as a favour to someone else, because I'd lost my job on the Sunday Express. And this new editor turned up and looked at me and thought, what are you doing on this magazine? This is a magazine for women in their 40s. The features are about how to date again after your divorce. And I was a sort of 23-year-old, 24-year-old And I kind of looked at that and I went, yeah, I have no idea why I'm here also. And fortunately, this opportunity came up, and I interviewed for this deputy editorship role on a magazine that I have to say I'd never heard of. And I got the job. And somehow it was a funny interview because this woman who I worked for, she was a great editor called Katie Hillier, but she talked a lot. And I remember she said to me at the beginning of the interview, so tell me about your interest in food. And I said, well, I eat. And I was going to expand on that, but she just went off on one and talked at me for an hour. And so I hadn't explained my credentials, my interest in food at all, but I got the job. So I must have been a good listener.
Mm.
And so you said you studied politics at universities. How did you go from politics into the sort of journalism role?
Well, yeah, I did some politics and government at the University of Kent, and this was a subject that I was fascinated by, and I loved it. And I studied a bit of American politics. I studied the power of the media, how the media worked in Britain, and how media and politics connect, and the power of people in media and the links with politics, etc., etc. And these things really fascinated me, although I'd actually gone to university to study social anthropology. And I realized very quickly this was an error, because I wasn't really interested in, strange activities in the Mbuti tribe in somewhere I've no idea where. And just didn't, I think I'd managed just to fluke this subject to get into Kent. I was a lazy schoolboy, and I somehow managed to persuade someone to give me university education. So anyway, I had an option to study politics, and after the first year, I just thought, well, I'm going to switch from my option, from the main, and do that as my main thing. So I did politics and media, and left with a degree, what we used to call a Desmond, 2-2, a kind of unremarkable degree. I didn't go to my graduation ceremony. I didn't think I was worthy of any form of educational award, to be honest, because I hadn't done very much apart from sit in a pub and make friends. And I did go to lectures, I suppose. But anyway, so I sort of scratched around for a while, got this job I'm trying to think really. I did shifts on various diaries. So I turned up at the Evening Standard and did a shift, and they sort of sent me off to some parties where I had to speak to celebrities and write down things they said and try and formulate it into a small block of text that was a story. And I did a similar thing at the Telegraph on what was then called the Peterborough column for Quentin Letts, who was the editor, and then Robert Hardman, who are obviously very distinguished journalists now. So I kind of bobbed around doing diary work, and I have to say retrospectively that was incredibly good experience, because if you can write a diary story, you can encapsulate a story. It's got to have a beginning, a middle, and end. It's got to have people, it's got to have quotes, it's got to have color, but it can't be over the top, and it's got to be straight, but it's got to have a sense of enough color and spirit to drive your interest in through reading it. So actually writing diary copy was probably some of the greatest experience I had to later become a writer and an editor, because it was about encapsulating information succinctly. So yeah, I did kind of diary work, and then funnily enough, I got a job in politics. I used to work for an MP called Bill Cash, and this was during the Maastricht rebellions, when the major government was at a knife edge of these knife edge votes night after night, as the Tory rebels tried to defeat them on Maastricht. And Bill Cash was the sort of leader of the rebels. And I came back from Greece and managed to get a job in his office. And I ended up being his kind of PA, and used to sort of scan the press for him and give him the bits I thought were interesting. And so I helped work with him, and we had a huge enjoyment. It was a wonderful time. And actually, it was while I was there that I met a guy called Charles Lewington, who was then political editor of the Sunday Express. Mm. He asked me about, what I was up to, and I said, well, I'd love to work on a newspaper. And he got me an interview on a magazine called Classic, which was one of the colour supplements for the Sunday Express. And I got a job as a researcher. And then from researcher, I started writing features at the paper. And so that was my first sort of job on a newspaper. And
So writing these diary blogs and whatnot, how difficult, or was that quite daunting for you to begin writing? Because it's not an easy skill set to develop, is it?
No, I think really also in terms of my skills to write, there was a wonderful man called Barnaby Lennon who ended up being the headmaster of Harrow, and now is he's a very key player in the independent public school sector. And he taught me geography, and he taught me how to write an essay. He taught me about structure, taught me about how to begin, middle, end, summarize, think succinctly. And Barnaby Lennon taught me how to learn, really. I have to say, it was that sort of structured learning and structured essay writing, the technique of writing an essay and being lucid and being clear. He talked so much about the importance of technique of essay writing. And that actually was very useful in terms of journalistic pieces in later life. So that coupled, I suppose, with that diary writing experience, and then being in the newsroom of a Sunday paper, which was pretty lively, being sent on stories. And, I never had any training. I mean, there are people who, go to journalism college or start off on the regions. I kind of did, diary work and managed to, get a job on a paper. And I suppose you just learn on the hoof, really. You see people attack your copy and knock it into shape, and you gradually learn. And, when there's huge pressure and you learn to write fast, it's a great steep learning curve, and it was great fun. I mean, I was sent on the most ridiculous stories. I was the kind of office stunt man. I was always having to dress up as people, impersonate people. If there was a job that no one else would do, Sitwell was sent off, and I sent off to scour the streets of Tewkesbury dressed as Barbara Cartman with pretend mini chihuahuas with me. I had to dress up and pretend to be Liam Gallagher swaggering through London. I had to invade top secret fashion shoots. So I was sent on all these sort of stunts and sort of would-be, undercover.
Quite an experience, though.
Reporting jobs. Yeah, and I have to say, years later, when I was editing a food magazine, and I was sending some young scribbler off to interview a farmer, and they grumbled, I sort of thought, come on, you have no idea how easy these jobs are. And the other thing is, because I worked in a newspaper and we had to write to deadline, under pressure, in a noisy office, quickly, I've always been able to write wherever I am. I mean, apart from if there's music playing, which diverts me, but I can, I write very, very quickly, and I can write with noise around me. And that's something that I've learned over the years, and I'm quite proud of, actually. I do bash out copy quite fast, and I'm quite efficient, and I tend to write copy that doesn't need to be, hacked away at.
Getting your first job as a food critic at Waitrose, did you sort of go on a crash course or anything to learn more about food and critiquing it?
I mean, I wasn't hired as a food critic. I was hired as a deputy editor of this magazine that became Waitrose Food Illustrated. So I was a journalist working on a food magazine. And so my job was to deputise the editor and help run this magazine and write stuff and proof pages and give it direction to the art department and come up with ideas and so on. So, and then I got the job as editor a few years later when the editor quit, and I fought and got that job. I mean, I remember that period, I realized that this was an incredibly important path for me, that I either went for this job and didn't get it. Went for the job and got it, or I didn't get it. And then I was second in command to someone who beat me to a job. And I just saw a miserable future if I didn't get this job. So I put everything into it. I fought really hard for it. I did a really good presentation, and I persuaded them to hire me. So I became editor of this magazine, which I then ran for 17, 18 years or something. And meanwhile, I got other bits and pieces, other sort of jobs here and there. And I started to do bits of radio, started to do bits of television, did a show called Great Food Live that Jenny Barnett used to present on UK TV. I started doing bits of radio. And then Masterchef popped up. I can't remember the first time I was asked to go on it, but they obviously were trying out people. And I turned up and, was on that show and I suppose 15, 16, 17, I don't know how many years later I'm still doing it. So I suppose someone gives you a go somewhere. In terms of being a critic, I suppose I've learned over the years to see something, think about something, work out how to convey what I think in terms of language that are easy to understand and maybe entertaining, colour. It's all the same sort of techniques as writing those diary columns, I suppose. So, food criticism was never something that I went into, and it was something I sort of drifted into as an adjunct to my main job, which was being a magazine editor.
So the world of journalism and food critique is very much, food critic is part of the world of journalism. For someone working in the industry, what is an average day like? What are you actually doing in the world of journalism?
Well, right now my life is very different. So if you ask me now, I'm in Somerset. Restaurants are shut. I'm desperately trying to feel good about the future. I've become, for many years I was editorial director of John Brown Media, and I ran the magazine for Waitrose, and I pitched and launched magazines for food brands around the world. And I worked very closely with my then boss and my friend Andrew Hirsch, who ran the company, and we pitched to supermarkets globally and ran their content programs. Some of which are still going. We were very successful when we won some and we lost some. So that was a day job that I had for many years. Now I'm a freelance, so my life is very varied. I mean, in normal times, I'm in London maybe a couple of days a week. I do quite a number of things because I do TV and radio and podcasts. I have a wine shop called William's House Wines, which I launched in lockdown. I write books, and I consult on various projects here, there, and everywhere. And then I visit restaurants. So in normal times, I'll certainly eat professionally once a week in a restaurant. But I might also have meetings and eat in other places. Funny enough, when I was working at Waitrose Food Illustrated, I probably ate in a restaurant 2 or 3 times a day. But wow, now that I'm down in the countryside and life's slightly quieter because we can't, travel anywhere, life's different. So in lockdown, my life is also dictated to by our small children. So I have older teenagers. I've got Barney, who's 8, so that means we get up at 7 with Walter, and he's 2, so we have breakfast together. So a lot of my day is also dictated to by our small children. Yeah, and I work in between. So, life is very different now. I used to have a team of, maybe 16, 17 people. I used to schmooze and network day and night. Now it's different, but I can't wait for that life to return in some shape or form. In terms of, it's very hard when you're a kind of entrepreneurial journalist like I am. You're running little businesses, little projects, and you're doing it, from the middle of the Somerset countryside, and you can't meet people. It's really hard, actually, because life is about schmoozing and networking and making connections and building on those connections and trying to turn connections into financial reward.
I was going to say, actually, how important is the building of your network to this career?
It's huge, actually. Partly it's something that comes instinctively and naturally anyway, because I am quite gregarious and social, and I like making friends. And some of the friends that I've made are people that I end up working with, either as colleagues or in a sort of, client agency relationship. I mean, it's very important. It's very important. And it is who you know to some extent, because you've got to get in and you've got to fight to get in, network. It's also what you know, obviously, because you've got to be able to deliver the goods.
Have you got any tips or anything to help people network that you've used over the years?
I don't know, just have a sort of instinctive ability to talk complete cack and try and amuse people so that they remember you. I mean, I think that there's nothing worse than pure networking events where people are literally sort of hoovering up contacts in order to make money, because human beings are social animals. We want to be entertained and enjoy ourselves, and if we can mix that with business, so much the better. I mean, I have to say, I think the food industry is a wonderful industry, because those of us who work in it, whether we're writing or whether we're a farmer or whether we're a restaurateur or whether we're a chef or whether we're any part of that network, you are so immersed in it that you do end up making great friends within that business, and friends for life who can also become people who you work with. And I think it's an extraordinary business to be in for that reason, because it's social, because at its heart, it's about breaking bread, eating, drinking, talking passionately about the things that motivate us for good or ill. The fact that you break bread with people is a wonderful way into sort of doing business with people as well. So you can do business with people over the table, but those people can also become great friends. So I have people I work with, do business with, who've become phenomenal friends. And it does mean it's hard for critics like me and social animals like me, and so many of us in this business, whether you're a chef or a writer, we'd like to go to new restaurants, we'd like to socialize. This year is torture for those reasons, and it is hard to build those networks. And if you think about young people trying to get into the business, I mean, how do you get into newspapers? How do you get into magazines? If you're not, how do you get into PR? You can't flag your way into those parties and those launches in order to make contacts with those commissioning editors or those PR people. How are you going to get into those worlds? Because not everything is advertised. Stuff is advertised, but often people like to recruit people that they know, either because they bumped into them or because they've been recommended. And, it's by no means a closed shop, but you always like to hire someone from a personal recommendation. It's so difficult, the whole process of recruiting, interviewing and so on, and trying to fight your first instinctive thoughts about someone and trying to work out is this the right person? Do I want to hire them? And if they come with a recommendation, it does make life easier.
You've alluded to a few already, but what would be some personality traits that you've seen yourself and other journalists around you that really help you thrive in that industry?
I think having a sense of humor and enjoying yourselves and being gregarious and outgoing is really important. I don't think there's much room for being just a miserable food critic. But also, it depends what you do. I mean, if you were paid so well as a restaurant critic that you wouldn't need to do anything else, then you could be a miserable bastard who just went out, ate, and grumbled and wrote about it spectacularly well and beautifully. But because restaurant criticism cannot sustain my life and all the ankle biters that are around me, I have to do other things. And life is a struggle financially, I have to say, right now. So it's important because, I've learned that you have to sell, and I sell wine, and I have to sell copy. I have to sell podcasts. So the ability to sell, I mean, if you want to be a freelance writer, you've got to be an entrepreneur. You've got to realize that you're running your own business. But the other thing that I wish someone had told me sort of 30 years ago is that if you're going to be a wage slave for 20 years, you've got to remember when you come out of it the other end, you won't have anything unless you've taken investment in the company. And I think if you can start your own thing, or even on the side, as young as possible, so that you have ownership in some part of a business that you can then grow, that will pay dividends in the end if it works. Whereas if you're just a slave to the PAYE and the company, I mean, great, you could have a wonderful life, but when you come out of it, you're not going to have any capital. I wish someone had told me that.
I think that's great advice.
And I also wish that someone at school had sort of taught us about the absolute fundamental need to be an entrepreneur, to understand some idea of business, to be able to pitch, to be able to stand. I've learned on my own how to stand up and speak in public and how to talk to groups of people and how to present. But presentation, pitching, and it's so much more important these days because of the digital world and of course lockdown. Those moments when you actually do meet someone face to face, or you do need to have an ability to convey and speak with clarity and order and lucidity. And if you haven't been able to teach that to yourself and you haven't been trained in that, then you will struggle. These real moments of eye contact are more important than ever. And I wish I'd been taught some semblance of business skills at school.
Are there any other skills that you think would have helped you in your career that weren't as obvious?
No, I'd love to have been learn how to rob banks and escape without anyone knowing. So to be a sort of digital thief or something, that would have been quite handy. Cyber thief, but no, I don't know. I mean, I've done all right, and I can write. I write books. I do what I do, writing and broadcasting, and actually, it's all the things that you've learned along the way that make you what you are and help formulate the person that you are. Mm. So it's all very well looking back and saying, I wish I'd been taught that. But actually, when you've taught it yourself and you've learned it yourself, it's probably better in a way. Although, as I say, I wish I'd had a grounding in business, although I have to say I can't add up. So there's probably a reason why I didn't do any business courses, because I'm completely inept when it comes to figures and numbers. Although I have learned that in order to make money, you need to buy something for one price, sell it for something else, and make sure there's a margin.
Yeah, so that helps.
I have learned that. And I do now have a calculator on my desk, which is not something I had 20, 30 years ago.
What would be some of the biggest positives and opportunities you've had out of this career so far?
Positives. I mean, I've won awards, which is great. I won awards as Editor of the Year awards and various awards from the BSMEs, the PPAs, which are the sort of Oscars of magazine journalism, which I'm very proud of. The things that I'm immensely proud of are the achievements I had at John Brown of pitching magazines overseas and winning business. That I found hugely satisfying. I think I'm deeply proud of the books that I was commissioned to write and have written. And I've written a few, some of which has been translated around the world. So I suppose I'm very proud of the books that I've written. I'm very proud of Eggs or Anarchy, which was this extraordinary story of how Lord Woolton fed Britain in the Second World War, which I still think more people should read.
Oh, wow.
And this was a story that had never been written before, based on all of the food minister's diaries that had never been seen before, and his wife's diaries that had never been seen before. Mm. So I think and I suppose also because my family were writers, and my grandfather wrote 130 plus books.
Oh, wow.
The fact that I've had 2 or 3 fills me with pride. Mm. But it's also, it's a bit, I don't sort of sit and think about these things because I'm just constantly panicking about what's going to happen next and where the next avalanche of money is going to pour in. And because I'm slightly bemused at the moment as to where I'm going to have to stem the flow of cash.
Yes.
I'm slightly worried it's not going to happen. So,
I
also, I run supper clubs as well, and this was an absolute key part of my income. And of course, completely dried up at the moment. So, I mean, as soon as life gets back to normal, I'm itching to get going again. But yeah.
Well, when we were obviously doing a bit of research about you and your career, like the opportunities this world of journalism be able to write and get into a world like food. I mean, you mentioned it, you're very entrepreneurial, and you've got that cider, the 3 C's that you co-founded, and you talked about the wine club you do, and it's really, once you get into something and build a network, like you say, the opportunities are quite vast, aren't they?
Well, I'd like to think they are. It doesn't feel like it right now, but then I'm feeling slightly gloomy and depressed because we're looking at a government that want to sort of savagely pin us down with more tiers, and for some reason want to destroy the hospitality industry because it feels like the right thing to do for them from where they're sitting. So Right now, I don't feel that way. I need to steel myself and convince myself that actually 2021 could be an astonishing year once we are unleashed from captivity. But you know, I think I've put in quite a lot of groundwork this year for a good subsequent year, I would have thought, and I'd like to think that I can grow my wine business, which is really exciting me. But also, I'm excited that restaurants can reopen and I can get back to doing my day job.
Definitely.
And what would be some of the less favourable aspects of the industry?
Less favourable?
Yes, yeah.
I don't know, having death threats.
Really gets that bad?
Yeah, there was a guy who didn't enjoy a restaurant I'd reviewed and started leaving a lot of threatening messages. He was foolish in that every single message he either left in text or on voicemail or on email. So I catalogued them so that he couldn't then pretend that it hadn't happened and that I was the lunatic for inventing this.
Oh my word.
And I've suffered the odd international incident. So I think that sort of I've felt the very sharp end of social media, very viciously so. Some people may say I deserved it. Others I don't know about. You know, when you appear on TV, it's either the downside or the upside, depending on how you're feeling. The abuse you get. Someone said the other day that was it William Sitwell is a weapons grade toff wanker. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than watching him being eaten slowly by a shark.
Oh my word.
I actually thought that was so brilliantly written, and it must have been done by a friend of mine. So I think that the tough end of the business can be the abuse you get, but you mustn't take it seriously. The tough end of the business is, I suppose, just the endless pressure of weekly deadlines, that little bit of stress you constantly get, but it's that stress that drives you on and makes you write a good piece. The constant terror of being unemployed, having your contract ended, keeps me fresh, or you could say paranoid, depending on your point of view. So, I don't rest on my laurels. I am constantly fighting to try and work to find new revenue streams, because I'm not a salaried man anymore, but I'm actually probably really relishing this time in my life.
Well, we like to go away and find about research figures of average incomes for the industries we talk about, and just see if you would agree with these figures. So for journalism, I'm sure it varies in whichever field you're in, but it seemed to range from between 25 to about 100,000 could be an average income for journalism.
It could be. You tell me. I don't know, really.
Well, those were the figures that we found from quite a few sources.
No, I think certainly when I worked at John Brown Media, editorial assistants were on sort of 18 to 20. I would say probably features editors probably on about 35, 40. Art directors maybe 40, 45. Then senior editorial people might have been 60 plus. Similar, I suppose, people in the ad teams, and then there were a few people who managed to push a little bit above that. So that's probably not far off.
Apart from maybe the odd shark eating death threat, what would be something that's not in the job description that you had to deal with?
That I've had to deal with?
Yeah, maybe just something every day that you weren't expecting to happen whilst you were in journalism.
Oh God, probably had so much fun.
Okay,
that's a good one.
I mean, seriously, in normal working life, the unbelievable pleasure I have from the friends that I've made, from breakfasts with PRs to lunches with contacts and dinners with people and drinks, the social aspect of this business is certainly not something that you see on the CV.
Yeah.
And I think that if you enjoy going out and meeting people, and you're in the food world and you're a food writer, or you're in that sort of sphere, then, if you are outgoing and extroverted and you like people, I think you can be an absolute blast, I have to say. And as I say, that's that's not something that's in the job description. So maybe that answers your question.
Does. And what's your best piece of advice for anyone listening to this and thinking, actually, I want to go at this?
Well, if you want to be a food critic, if you want to be a restaurant critic, the most important thing is you can become a writer. You have to be a journalist first. You've got to be able to construct a sentence. You've got to be able to think and write lucidly. You have to know how to construct a sentence, paragraphs, and entire pieces, and draw people through with the right amount of color so that it's not over the top and your prose is not embarrassingly purple. You have to know how to write. And I would say, therefore, you have to know how to read, and you have to read, and you need to read, and not just newspapers and magazines, but books and some of the best writers out there. You know, whether they're English and British writers like Evelyn Waugh and P.G. Wodehouse, or they're, you know, writers like Toni Morrison, or, you know, or older US authors, whether they're Aldous Huxley or whatever. I think you need to read and read and read and love the descriptive powers of the English language. And if you've got that in you, then you can have a go at yourself of constructing sentences and trying to translate events into characterful, entertaining articles.
Brilliant. And would you still go into the industry knowing everything you know now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I get a piece of action at the beginning.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, William. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Lovely. It's been fun thinking about all these things. I appreciate you having me on as a guest. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Where can people find you on social media and anything that you're up to?
Well, at William Sitwell is my Instagram and my Twitter feed. My website is williamsitwell.com. My wine site is williamshousewines.com. But williamsitwell.com has full details of the entirety of my food empire. So that's a good starting point.
Brilliant. Thank you again so much.
Fantastic. Thanks, William.
Thank you.